There is a very specific smell to the flight line at 0400 hours. It is a harsh metallic blend of JP-8 jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the dry dust of the Texas tarmac. For an AH-64 Apache pilot, that smell is the scent of focus. It is the scent of control. When you are strapped into the front seat of an 18,000-pound flying tank armed with Hellfire missiles and a 30mm chain gun, you are the master of your environment. Every switch, every gauge, every sensor is designed to give you absolute authority over life and death. You are trained to identify threats from miles away, to calculate trajectories in a fraction of a second, and to eliminate the enemy before they even know you are in the sky. But military training has a blind spot. It teaches you how to neutralize threats wearing uniforms or carrying weapons in a combat zone. It does not teach you how to defend against a threat operating out of a luxury apartment in Miami, wearing a tailored suit and hiding behind the title of father. His name was Thomas. I hesitate to even use the word father because it implies a level of duty and provision that he never possessed. He walked out on my mother and me when I was 7 years old. There was no dramatic screaming match, no thrown plates. He simply packed a leather duffel bag, said he was going to a real estate seminar in Las Vegas, and never came back. For the next 18 years, Thomas was nothing more than a phantom. A signature on an occasional belated birthday card. A rumor of a failed startup here, a defaulted loan there. He was a man who spent his entire life looking for a shortcut to wealth. A man who believed that hard work was for the unimaginative. I was the exact opposite. I chose the Army. I chose the discipline, the grueling selection process of flight school, the endless hours of studying aerodynamics and tactical maneuvers. By the time I was 25, I had my wings, my command, and orders for my first combat deployment to the Middle East. It was during the final weeks of pre-deployment preparations that Thomas suddenly reappeared. In the military, preparing for a combat deployment involves a tedious, exhausting process known as Soldier Readiness Processing, or SRP. It is an administrative assembly line designed to ensure you are physically, mentally, and legally prepared to go to war, and implicitly prepared not to come back. You get your immunizations, you update your dental records, you draft your last will and testament, and you confirm your service members' group life insurance, the SGLI. The SGLI is a standard $500,000 life insurance policy provided by the government. It is a grim reality of the profession. You designate who gets the money if you come home in a flag-draped transfer case. Naturally, my mother was my sole beneficiary. I was sitting in the corner of a crowded staging facility, exhausted, staring at a stack of threat intelligence briefings for the airspace I was about to enter when my phone rang. The caller ID was an unknown Florida number. I answered, expecting a logistical update from my command. Instead, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in nearly a decade. "Carter, it's your dad." I didn't react. I didn't feel a sudden rush of emotion or the sting of old wounds. I just felt a mild, tactical annoyance. "I'm deploying in 14 days, Thomas. What do you want?" He played his part flawlessly. He sounded older, humbled, his voice carrying the perfect pitch of manufactured regret. He told me he had recently suffered a minor heart attack. He fed me a well-rehearsed monologue about how facing his own mortality made him realize what a terrible mistake he had made leaving us. He said he had finally found success in financial consulting and wanted to make things right. He couldn't rewrite the past, he claimed, but he wanted to protect my future. His pitch was smooth. He proposed setting up a comprehensive family emergency trust. He insisted on fronting the money to establish a legal framework that would manage my finances, protect my assets, and ensure I had a massive safety net waiting for me when I got back from my deployment. He spoke with the polished cadence of a salesman who knew exactly how to bypass a target's critical thinking. "I know you're flying into a war zone, Carter," he said, his voice dropping an octave to simulate genuine paternal concern. "I know how dangerous it is, and I know I have zero right to ask for your forgiveness. But let me do this. Let me set up this financial armor for you. It's the least I can do as your father." I didn't care about his money, and I certainly didn't believe in his redemption. But I was operating on 3 hours of sleep. My mind was consumed with survival tactics, evasion protocols, and the immense responsibility of keeping my flight crew alive. The mental bandwidth required to argue with him, to interrogate his motives, simply wasn't there. "What do you need?" I asked, looking at my watch. "Just your social security number to verify your identity for the trust documents, and I'll email you a DocuSign link for a blanket digital authorization. It just allows my legal team to file the paperwork on your behalf while you're in the air. You won't have to worry about a thing." In the military, you learn to prioritize threats. A surface-to-air missile is a primary threat. An estranged, fast-talking father trying to ease his guilty conscience by doing some paperwork seemed like a non-threat. It was a distraction. I wanted the distraction gone so I could get back to my mission. I gave him my social. I opened the email he sent 2 minutes later and clicked Approve on the digital signature platform. I didn't read the fine print. I didn't review the attached PDF. I swatted him away like a mosquito locked my phone and walked back to the briefing room. That single click was the greatest tactical error of my life. Thomas was not setting up a family trust. He was not experiencing a moral awakening. He was looking at my deployment orders not as a source of parental anxiety, but as an investment opportunity. With my social security number, my date of birth, and a legally binding digital signature, Thomas had the keys to my entire administrative existence. And he wasted absolutely no time weaponizing it. The very first thing he did was bypass the military's internal security firewalls. Using my credentials, he logged into the Mill Connect portal, the digital hub for all service member benefits. He navigated straight to the SGLI section. In less than 5 minutes, he executed a complete override of my military life insurance policy. He erased my mother's name as the primary beneficiary and inserted his own. Just like that, if I took a piece of shrapnel to the neck in the desert, $500,000 of federal money would be wired directly into his bank account. But Thomas was a gambler, and $500,000 wasn't enough to satisfy a lifetime of failed schemes. He wanted a bigger payout. Armed with my stolen identity and the forged digital authorization, he went to the civilian market. Over the next 48 hours, while I was kissing my mother goodbye and boarding a C-17 transport jet bound for the Middle East, Thomas was busy opening 3 separate massive private life insurance policies in my name. He targeted high-risk, high-reward policies. He lied on the applications, of course. He used a loophole in the digital underwriting process of a mid-tier insurance conglomerate, bypassing the mandatory military service disclosures. He purchased a $500,000 policy, then another, then a third. Total coverage $1.5 million. But here is the detail that truly highlighted the depth of his sociopathy. In the world of life insurance, there is a specific rider you can purchase, an add-on clause, known in the industry as accidental death and dismemberment, or more commonly, double indemnity. It stipulates that if the insured party dies not of natural causes, but through a sudden violent accident or catastrophic event, the payout is multiplied by 2. Thomas specifically requested and paid the premium for the double indemnity rider on all 3 civilian policies. He didn't just buy insurance. He leveraged my mortality. He looked at a 25-year-old woman flying an attack helicopter into a hostile kinetic combat zone, and he saw a winning lottery ticket. If my aircraft went down in flames, if I was shot out of the sky, his payout wouldn't be $1.5 million. It would be $3 million. Combined with the military SGLI my father had successfully placed, a $3.5 million bounty on my head. As my boots hit the sand in the Middle East, I was completely oblivious to the financial crosshairs painted on my back. I was focused on the horizon, on the enemy I could see. I had no idea that back in the United States, a man sharing my DNA was sitting in a leather chair, checking the news feeds every morning, waiting for a military press release. He wasn't praying for my safe return. He was waiting for the sandstorms to swallow me whole. He was waiting for the phone call informing him that a casualty assistance officer was standing on his porch. He was betting heavily on my death. He just didn't realize who he was betting against. The desert does not care about your flight hours. It does not care about your rank, your armor, or your mission. In the Al Anbar province, the environment is just as lethal as the insurgents hiding within it. We were 3 hours into a routine nighttime overwatch mission when the sky simply swallowed us. A haboob, a massive thousands of feet high wall of blinding sand and dust, rolled over our sector with zero warning. In an instant, our thermal imaging was blinded. The cockpit canopy sounded like it was being sandblasted by a fire hose. Visibility dropped to absolute zero. When you lose visual reference in a helicopter, you rely entirely on your instruments. But sand is the enemy of the Apache's turbine engines. The intakes began to choke, the RPMs dropped, and then the ultimate nightmare scenario, a tracer round from an unsophisticated shoulder-fired anti-aircraft gun on the ground, fired blindly into the storm by an insurgent hoping for a lucky strike, found our tail rotor. There was a violent concussive shudder. The aircraft immediately began an uncommanded right-hand spin. In flight school, they drill emergency procedures into your muscle memory so deeply that you react before your brain has time to process the fear. I cut the throttles to remove the torque, dropped the collective pitch, and initiated an auto-rotation, a controlled fall from the sky, trading altitude for rotor speed, hoping to flare at the very last second to cushion the impact. We hit the dunes hard. The landing gear sheared off, the airframe groaned, and the cockpit filled with the acrid smoke of frying avionics. But we were alive. My co-pilot had a fractured collarbone. I had a severe concussion and bruised ribs. But the real problem was the silence. Our communications array was completely destroyed. We had no radio, no GPS beacon that could punch through the atmospheric interference of the raging sandstorm. We were grounded in hostile territory, totally blind, and completely cut off from the command center. In military terminology, my co-pilot and I officially became Dust 1 Duty Status Whereabouts Unknown. After 24 hours, that classification upgrades to something much heavier. MIA. Missing in action. For 48 hours, we survived in the wreckage. We rationed the 2 liters of water from our survival kits. We kept our M4 rifles locked and loaded, scanning the swirling dust for any movement. We baked in the daytime heat and froze in the desert night. We did what soldiers do. We endured. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm finally broke, and a team of Army Rangers and 2 Black Hawk helicopters descended on our position. They extracted us, flew us back to the forward operating base, and rushed us straight into the medical bay. The lights were blindingly bright. The smell of antiseptic was overwhelming. I was sitting on a gurney, an IV line pumping saline into my dehydrated veins, expecting my battalion commander to walk in for a preliminary debrief. Instead, the curtain pulled back and 2 officers walked in. One was a captain, wearing the insignia of the JAG Corps, the Judge Advocate General, the Army's legal branch. The other man wasn't in uniform. He wore a tactical polo, a badge clipped to his belt, and carried a ruggedized military tablet. He introduced himself as Special Agent Vance from the OIG, the Office of Inspector General for the Department of Veterans Affairs. You do not get visited by the VA OIG in a combat theater medical tent unless a very specific, very federal line has been crossed. "Glad you're alive, Chief Warrant Officer Carter," Agent Vance said, his voice flat, devoid of the usual relief you hear after a rescue. He set the tablet on the metal tray table next to my bed. Because according to the United States government, you've been legally dead for 24 hours. I stared at him, the fog of the concussion momentarily lifting. Excuse me? Captain Miller, the JAG officer, stepped forward. When your aircraft went down and your status was upgraded to MIA, standard protocol was initiated. A casualty assistance officer was dispatched to notify your designated next of kin. My mother, I said immediately. No, Miller corrected, pulling a printout from a manila folder. According to the MilConnect database, your primary beneficiary was changed 14 days ago. The notification went to your father, Thomas Carter. A cold, heavy stone dropped in my stomach. The family trust. The digital signature. Agent Vance, I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. What did he do? Vance tapped the screen of his tablet and turned it toward me. Grief has a specific timeline, Carter. People usually deny it. They cry. They ask about search and rescue operations. Your father skipped all of that. He received the knock on his door at 1800 hours on Tuesday, informing him you were missing in a combat zone and presumed killed. Vance paused, letting the silence hang in the sterile room. At 0800 hours on Wednesday morning, 14 hours later, he submitted a catastrophic loss claim to the VA for your $500,000 SGLI policy. He didn't ask the casualty officer if there were rescue teams looking for you. He asked for the forms required to expedite the payout. I looked at the digital timestamps on the documents displayed on the tablet. I felt my heart rate steadying, the monitor beside my bed beeping in a slow, rhythmic cadence. I wasn't heartbroken. I wasn't devastated. I was experiencing the icy, calculated clarity of a soldier identifying a hostile target. It gets worse, Captain Miller said softly. The VA's automated fraud detection system flagged the speed of the claim and ran a cross-reference on his Social Security number. It triggered alerts in the civilian sector. While you were missing, your father also filed preliminary death claims with 3 private life insurance companies. Policies you allegedly took out right before you deployed, totaling $1.5 million, Vance added, all with double indemnity riders for combat-related death. Your father was about to walk away with $3.5 million. He bypassed electronic wire transfers likely to avoid banking holds on massive sudden deposits. He explicitly requested that the insurance companies and the VA issue physical checks and send them via expedited certified mail. He wanted the checks mailed to his door. He wanted the paper in his hands before anyone could realize I wasn't a corpse buried under the Al Anbar sand. If that ranger team hadn't found you today, Vance said, the first civilian check for $750,000 would have arrived at his Miami address tomorrow morning. I sat there, the IV fluid cold in my arm, and processed the tactical picture. Thomas had weaponized my service. He had bet heavily on my death, using my stolen identity to fund his luxury lifestyle. He assumed that because I was in a war zone thousands of miles away, I would simply become a casualty statistic, unable to fight back. He assumed the military bureaucracy would just churn out the paperwork and hand him a fortune. He assumed wrong. Agent Vance? I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. He requested the checks via certified mail, yes, through the United States Postal Service, correct. I looked at Captain Miller. I knew the Uniform Code of Military Justice and I knew federal law. The moment Thomas used the postal system to attempt to collect fraudulent funds, he crossed a threshold that most white-collar criminals severely underestimate. Captain, I said, pulling the blankets off my legs, I need you to contact the United States Postal Inspection Service right now. Miller blinked, surprised. The Postal Inspectors, Carter, the FBI usually handles. The FBI is backlogged, and they plea bargain. I cut him off, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Mail fraud is Title 18 United States Code Section 1341. It carries a 20-year federal prison sentence, and the postal inspectors have a 98% conviction rate. Thomas thinks he's playing a family game. I want to introduce him to the oldest federal law enforcement agency in the country." Vance smiled, a slow, predatory grin forming on his face. He understood exactly what I was building. I survived the crash. I survived the desert. Now I was going to use the federal government to ensure that the man who prayed for my death would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cage. Most people think of the United States Postal Service as the people who deliver junk mail and Amazon packages. They view the mail carrier as a benign, invisible part of suburban life. That is a civilian perspective. If you operate in the world of federal law enforcement, you know that hidden inside the post office is a division called the United States Postal Inspection Service. Founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1772, the USPIS is the oldest federal law enforcement agency in the country. They predate the FBI by over a century. They carry firearms, they execute high-risk search warrants, and their jurisdiction is absolute. If a crime touches a piece of mail, a postage stamp, or a mailbox, it belongs to them. And their conviction rate is a terrifying 98%. 24 hours after I was pulled from the wreckage in Al Anbar, I was sitting in a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility on the forward operating base. I had a bandage wrapped around my ribs and a bruised jaw, but my mind was operating with crystalline precision. I was looking at a secure video conference screen. On the screen was Captain Miller from JAG Agent Vance, from the VA OIG, and a new face, Postal Inspector Elias Thorne, broadcasting from the USPIS field office in Miami. Thorne had the weathered, exhausted look of a man who had spent 30 years putting white-collar sociopaths behind bars. "Chief Warrant Officer Carter," Inspector Thorne said, his voice a gravelly baritone that echoed through the secure comms line. "I've reviewed the digital footprint. The forged signature, the IP addresses, the altered beneficiary forms. We have enough to charge your father with aggravated identity theft, Title 18, Section 1028A. But you requested my agency specifically. You don't just want him charged. You want him buried." "I want mail fraud, Inspector," I replied, leaning forward into the microphone. "Identity theft can be spun by a good defense attorney as a misunderstanding, a father trying to manage his deployed daughter's estate. But 18 U.S. Code Section 1341, using the postal system to execute a scheme to defraud, that requires intent. That requires a physical act. If we arrest him now, it's attempted fraud. I want a completed crime." Thorne gave a slow, grim nod of approval. "You want a controlled delivery." "Exactly. A controlled delivery is the crown jewel of postal sting operations. It is a trap so legally airtight that defense attorneys usually advise their clients to plead guilty the moment the discovery file is opened. Law enforcement intercepts a package containing illicit materials, drugs, weapons, or in this case, fraudulent funds. An undercover postal inspector, dressed as a regular letter carrier, delivers the package to the target. The moment the target physically signs the delivery slip and takes possession of the package, the crime is absolute. "Here is the tactical layout," Inspector Thorne explained, pulling up a schematic on the screen. "Your father has filed claims with the VA and 3 civilian agencies. We have already placed a hard freeze on the military SGLI payout. The VA OIG has it locked down. However, we have contacted the Legal Compliance Division at Apex Life and Casualty, the civilian company holding the largest of the 3 private policies. $750,000. Agent Vance chimed in. "Apex was about to hit the brakes when the fraud alert popped. We told them to take their foot off the pedal. We directed them to approve the claim, print the check, and mail it exactly as Thomas requested via USPS certified mail with a required signature." I watched the tracking data populate on the screen. It was a digital map of my father's greed. "The envelope contains a live check," Thorne continued. "It's a federal prop. The moment he takes possession, we void the routing numbers. But to him it will look like the first installment of his new fortune. It's currently at our sorting facility in Miami. We are staging the delivery for tomorrow at 1300 hours. Where's the drop zone? I asked. That's where his arrogance works against him, Thorne said, a hint of disgust in his voice. He didn't want it delivered to his apartment. According to his digital tracking requests, he rerouted the delivery to his country club in Coral Gables. He's hosting a luncheon there tomorrow. Apparently, he's already told his social circle that he's coming into a substantial family inheritance due to a recent tragedy. The temperature in the skiff seemed to drop. Captain Miller, the JAG officer, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was used to military justice, but the sheer sociopathic audacity of a father celebrating his daughter's supposed death at a country club was hard to stomach. I didn't feel sick. I felt validated. Any lingering microscopic shred of familial obligation I might have subconsciously held was vaporized. Thomas wasn't a misguided father. He was a hostile parasite. Let him have his luncheon, I said, my voice as flat as the desert tarmac. I want him surrounded by his peers when the trap snaps shut. Let him play the grieving wealthy father right up until the moment he signs the paper. Understood, Thorne said. I have a tactical team of 8 postal inspectors and 2 federal marshals ready to deploy. We will have eyes on the clubhouse from the perimeter. My undercover agent will make the approach in a standard USPS uniform. Chief Carter, you do understand that once he signs that green certified mail receipt, his life as he knows it is over? He is looking at a mandatory minimum for the identity theft, stacked consecutively with the mail fraud. He will not survive a federal sentence. Inspector Thorne, I replied, staring directly into the camera lens. 2 days ago, I watched tracer rounds rip through the tail of my aircraft. I watched my co-pilot bleed into the sand. We survived because we rely on our training, our equipment, and each other. My father relied on my death to buy a country club membership. I paused, letting the reality of the situation settle over the secure line. Print the green slip, hand him the pen. If he wants to sign away his freedom to finance his delusions, let him. Thorne gave a sharp, definitive nod. Target is locked, Chief. Delivery is scheduled for 1300. The screen went black. I leaned back in the metal chair and took a slow, calculated breath. Thousands of miles away, in the humid tropical air of Miami, Thomas was likely checking his phone, watching a little green bar slide across a USPS tracking app. He was watching his ship come in. He had no idea that the ship was a federal dreadnought, and its cannons were already aimed directly at his chest. The bait was in the mail. The trap was armed. All that was left was the signature. There is a distinct difference between watching a kinetic strike in a combat zone and watching a federal sting operation. When a Hellfire missile hits a target, there is fire concussive force and immediate chaotic destruction. But a federal takedown is silent right up until the final second. It is a surgical, administrative strike. It doesn't vaporize the target, it just permanently deletes their existence from free society. I watched the execution of Thomas Carter not from the sky, but from a secured laptop inside a windowless intelligence bunker in Iraq. Inspector Thorne had routed a live encrypted feed from a surveillance camera staged by his agents at the Coral Gables Country Club. The visual contrast was jarring. I was sitting in a blast-proof room breathing recycled, sand-filtered air wearing a combat uniform that still smelled of aviation fuel and smoke. On the screen, 7,000 miles away, it was a perfectly sunny afternoon in Miami. The camera was angled toward an exclusive outdoor dining patio that overlooked the 18th hole of a championship golf course. There was Thomas. He was wearing a tailored, cream-colored linen suit, sitting at the head of a long table draped in white cloth, surrounded by men in pastel polos and women in expensive sundresses. He was holding court. Through the audio feed, I could hear the clinking of crystal mimosa glasses and the hushed, sympathetic tones of his country club peers. He was playing the grieving father to absolute perfection. He kept his head slightly bowed, his voice carrying just the right amount of manufactured tremor as he accepted their condolences. I listened as he told them about my sacrifice. He told them how devastated he was, but that he found solace in knowing I had left behind a substantial estate to ensure he was taken care of. He called it a final act of a loving daughter. It was a masterclass in sociopathic theater. He was mourning a ghost, drinking imported champagne and waiting for his payout. At exactly 1300 hours Eastern Standard Time, the theater closed. Into the frame of the surveillance camera walked an anomaly. It was a man in the standard issue light blue uniform of the United States Postal Service. He wore the blue shorts, the striped shirt, and carried a leather satchel over his shoulder. To the wealthy patrons of the country club, he was invisible, just a working-class servant delivering the day's correspondence. They didn't notice the heavy tactical boots he was wearing. They didn't notice the slight bulge of Level 3A Kevlar body armor beneath his breathable polo shirt. And they certainly didn't notice the plainclothes federal marshals quietly taking up positions by the valet stand and the clubhouse exits. The undercover postal inspector walked directly onto the patio, his boots clicking softly against the terracotta tiles. He bypassed the maitre d' and walked straight up to the head of the table. "Excuse me, Thomas Carter?" Thomas looked up slightly, annoyed by the interruption of his performance. "Yes, I'm in the middle of a private luncheon." The undercover agent pulled a thick, rigid priority envelope from his satchel. "Certified mail from Apex Life and Casualty. I need a direct signature for delivery." I leaned closer to the monitor. In the bunker, the ambient noise of the bass faded away. My eyes were locked on Thomas. When Thomas heard the name of the insurance company, his entire demeanor shifted. The faux grief vanished, replaced instantly by the sharp, hungry glint of a predator spotting a meal. That envelope held a check for $750,000. It was his proof of concept. It was his victory lap. "Of course," Thomas said, offering a tight, polite smile to his guests as he stood up. "Excuse me for just a moment, everyone. Just some final estate paperwork." He reached out and took the envelope. The agent handed him a pen and a digital scanner, but then paused. "Actually, sir, for a package of this declared value, federal regulations require you to sign the physical PS Form 3811, the green receipt." The agent pulled the small green rectangular card from the back of the envelope. "Right on the bottom line, please." Thomas didn't hesitate. He didn't read the fine print. He didn't question why his daughter's death benefit was arriving with such bureaucratic ease. He was too blinded by his own greed. He took the pen, leaned over the teakwood table, and pressed the ink to the paper. He signed his name. In that exact fraction of a second, the legal trap slammed shut. The crime of mail fraud, Title 18, United States Code, Section 1341, requires the absolute physical use of the postal system in the execution of a scheme to defraud. By signing that green receipt, Thomas officially accepted the fraudulent funds through a federal carrier. The identity theft was no longer just a digital footprint. It was a completed physical felony with a paper trail locked into federal custody. The undercover agent took the green slip and the pen back. He checked the signature, verifying it was complete. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," the agent said. Then the postal worker disappeared, and the federal law enforcement officer took his place. The agent took one step back, dropping the mail satchel to the patio floor. His right hand reached to his belt, unclipped a gold badge and held it high, while his left hand dropped to his hip. "United States Postal Inspection Service," the agent's voice boomed, completely shattering the quiet luxury of the country club. "Thomas Carter, you are under arrest for mail fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft." For 2 agonizing seconds, Thomas just stared at the badge, his brain completely unable to process the data. He looked at the envelope in his hand, then back at the mailman. "What? No, there's a mistake. This is my daughter's life insurance. Do not move! Suddenly, the perimeter collapsed. 4 men who had been sitting at a nearby table, wearing golf attire, abruptly stood up, ripping away Velcro tearaway shirts to reveal heavy black tactical vests, emblazoned with Federal Agent, USPIS. They drew their weapons and converged on the table from all 4 sides. The wealthy guests screamed and scrambled backward, knocking over chairs and shattering crystal glasses. Thomas panicked. He took half a step backward, his hands instinctively coming up, but before he could even form a thought of resistance, 2 inspectors grabbed his arms, spun him around, and slammed him face first into the table. The linen suit crumpled. The envelope containing the fake federal check fluttered to the ground, landing in a puddle of spilled mimosa. I watched as cold steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around my father's wrists. I watched as an inspector read him his Miranda rights in front of the entire country club elite. I watched the utter, absolute destruction of a man who thought he could outsmart the system. He wasn't a master manipulator anymore. He was just a federal inmate with a bruised face and a ruined suit. They dragged him off the patio, past the shocked whispers of the people he had just been lying to, and shoved him into the back of an unmarked black SUV waiting by the valet. In the intelligence bunker in Iraq, Inspector Thorne's voice cracked over the secure audio line. "Target is secured, Chief Carter. Delivery complete." I closed the laptop. The legal aftermath was a slaughter. When a federal prosecutor has a controlled delivery physical signatures forged, digital IP logs, and the testimony of the VA Office of Inspector General, there is no trial. There is only a plea deal to avoid spending the rest of your natural life in a cage. Thomas tried to beg. He tried to have his public defender reach out to me, claiming he was mentally unwell, claiming he just wanted to secure the money so he could build a memorial in my honor. I never responded. I let the JAG officers and the federal prosecutors do the talking. The judge showed zero leniency. Using a combat deployment to perpetrate life insurance fraud on a service member is a sentencing enhancer. Thomas's assets, his cars, his bank accounts, the apartment in Miami, were all seized by the federal government under asset forfeiture laws to pay the mandatory restitution and fines. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. In the federal system, there is no parole. You serve 85% of your time minimum. He will be an old, broken man by the time he sees the outside of a concrete wall again. 3 weeks after the arrest, I was medically cleared for flight duty. I walked back out onto the tarmac in Al Anbar, the smell of JP8 jet fuel and hot sand filling my lungs. I climbed into the cockpit of a new Apache strapped into the harness and began my pre-flight sequence. My father looked at my uniform and saw a financial opportunity. He assumed that the miles between us made me vulnerable, that my duty to my country made me a prime target for quiet administrative theft. He bet everything he had on the assumption that I would die in a war zone. He was right about one thing. Someone's life did end because of that deployment. It just wasn't mine. He gambled on my death in a war zone. I made sure his freedom was the only casualty.